They called it a family barbecue, but to me it was a quarterly performance review with ribs. My name is Sloane Maddox, and at this table that name used to mean something. Now, it earned me pity looks, budget jokes, and questions about whether I could still afford rent. While they compared crypto ranches and designer gallery deals, I stood by the grill flipping ribs in silence. No one offered me a chair. No one touched the peach cobbler I brought. And when Vanessa's daughter chirped loud enough for the whole lawn to hear Mom says, "Aunt Sloane's poor. Is that why she doesn't have a husband?" no one corrected her. Not even my mother, but they had no idea. I wasn't just flipping ribs, I was flipping the script. Because 9 months ago, I bought the land they're sitting on. I stood there with the tongs in my hand, like it was my assigned role, the one everyone silently agreed I should play. Just like last year. Just like every year. Another Maddox family 4th of July. BBQ, same backyard at Prescott Yard. Same folding tables dressed up with gingham tablecloths, same sunburned cousins, trying to outboast each other like they were on a reality show no one else got invited to. No one had greeted me when I arrived. No one offered to take the foil pan of peach cobbler I'd brought, so I'd slid it into the fridge myself. I hadn't expected a grand welcome, but some acknowledgement of my presence, anything more than a nod, would have been nice. Instead, I got the usual silent side eyes and the occasional smirk like I'd shown up uninvited. I adjusted the burners and flipped a slab of ribs with more care than necessary. The grill sizzled in response. My tank top clung to my back from the combination of heat and humidity. Behind me, the party played on. Chase's voice rang out like it always did when he was on his second or third beer, too loud, too proud. He was seated in a collapsible chair under the canopy with his feet up, gesturing animatedly with a bottle of Lone Star beer. Closed on the ranch last week, he announced to whoever was willing to pretend to care. 1,800 acres in Montana, right on the edge of the Gallatin River. Neighbors with the guy who runs that new crypto exchange. Ever heard of him? Of course they had. Everyone nodded, impressed. My uncle slapped Chase's shoulder like he'd just won the lottery. Vanessa didn't miss a beat. She leaned forward, her glass of rosé tilted delicately in her hand like it was part of her body. "Oh, please," she said, voice full of faux modesty. "My gallery just landed a deal in Scottsdale. Expansion project. The desert aesthetic is trending, minimalist, arid, expensive." Someone across the table said, "Wow." Someone else said, "Of course it is." They were so desperate to outdo each other, I don't think they noticed how ridiculous they sounded. I kept my back to them, eyes on the ribs, watching the sauce bubble and caramelize. I'd marinated them the night before, my dad's old recipe with a twist of cider vinegar and brown sugar, but I doubted anyone would ask about that. Elaine, my mother, sat beneath the biggest umbrella, fanning herself with a folded magazine. She wore a pale blue sundress, and her hair was pulled into a perfect French twist, not a strand out of place. Her posture was as stiff as her opinion of me. She hadn't said a single word to me since I arrived. I stepped away from the grill long enough to set a stack of paper plates at the serving table, wiping my palms on a dish towel. No one noticed. Vanessa laughed at something. Chase whispered to her, and Aunt Georgia popped open another bottle of sparkling water. When I turned back, Vanessa's voice followed me. "Honestly, it's a little sad," she said, to no one in particular but loud enough to land. "Sloane had so much potential. Remember when she was going to be an attorney? And now, I mean, rentals." Chase snorted. "Maybe she's working on commission. Could explain the discount sneakers." I looked down at my shoes, worn but clean. Functional. Unlike the strappy wedges Vanessa was teetering around in on the grass, clearly impractical for a BBQ. I said nothing. That always seemed to bother them more than anything. Then came the moment I didn't see coming. Vanessa's daughter, 8, maybe 9, looked up from her plate, cheeks smudged with ketchup. She blinked innocently and piped up in that crystal-clear, chirpy voice only kids could get away with. "Mom says Aunt Sloane's poor. Is that why she doesn't have a husband?" The world went silent. Even the grill seemed to stop sizzling. No one moved. No one corrected her. Chase leaned back in his chair with a grin. Vanessa widened her eyes and said, "Oh, sweetie, no, don't say that." But she was smiling. Elaine didn't even blink. She just kept fanning herself. I walked over, crouched down next to the girl, and looked her in the eye. Being poor isn't about not having things, I said gently. It's about having nothing left to give. I have more than enough. She looked confused, then nodded slowly, uncertain. I smiled and stood brushing off my hands. Silence still lingered, like everyone wasn't quite sure what to say. I went back to the grill and flipped the ribs again. The skin was crisping just right. The smell of char and molasses cut through the tension like a knife. Behind me, the conversation resumed. A little stiffer, a little more cautious, but still loud enough to keep pretending. I glanced around the yard. Folding chairs, beer coolers, Costco cupcakes sweating in the sun. Cousins I used to build tree forts with now debated hedge funds and renovation loans. Everything looked the same, but it all felt different. Because I wasn't the same. They thought they knew who I was. They thought I still lived in that crummy apartment on the wrong side of Cedar Heights. They thought I walked away from the family business because I couldn't keep up. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know I owned the land beneath their lawn chairs. That 9 months ago, I signed the final deed transfer of Prescott Yard under one of my LLCs, and they'd been living on borrowed ground ever since. But I wasn't going to say that, not today. Let them laugh. Let them have their ribs. I had other things cooking. I flipped off the burners and closed the lid on the grill, letting the ribs rest. Around me, the laughter had shifted, tones dulled slightly, maybe from the heat, maybe from the words that slipped out of that little girl's mouth. Either way, I wasn't concerned. I was used to silence. In fact, silence was what raised me after I walked away from the Maddox name. It had been 12 years since I last played their game, since I sat at one of these tables and smiled like I belonged. I'd been 24, just out of college with a business degree and a heavy sense of suffocation I couldn't name yet. At the time, the family had plans for me. I was supposed to join Maddox Realty Group as a junior executive, shadow my uncle until I was ready to take over client relations for our Southern Legacy accounts. Elaine had already begun scheduling luncheons and personal styling appointments. There was a wardrobe plan and a man, because of course there was. Bryce Wexler, son of old oil money, tall-mannered, politically ambitious. His parents and mine had been drawing lines between our futures since prom. I was supposed to marry him before 25 and start breeding a newer, shinier version of the Maddox name. But I remember sitting across from him at brunch one morning, watching him stir his black coffee like he was bored to death, talking about offshore accounts and gun clubs in Wyoming, and realizing something deep in my chest: I would suffocate. In a life like that. Quietly. Politely. Permanently. So I said no. Not just to Bryce, but to all of it. The job offer, the share package, the condo downtown that came with a concierge and a monthly check. I turned it all down the same week I accepted a spot at the University of Oregon's master's program in urban planning. I didn't even tell them until I was already gone. Elaine had called a family dinner when she found out. I hadn't even been home 48 hours before she summoned everyone. I can still picture it. Her standing at the head of the dining table, fingers clutched around a wine glass, her voice trembling with fury masked as disappointment. She said I was selfish, ungrateful, immature. That no daughter of hers was going to throw away generations of work for a hippie degree and a life in the Pacific Northwest. She said I had embarrassed her and, worse, embarrassed the family name. Then she said the part I'll never forget. From now on, don't consider yourself a Maddox. She said it calmly, like she was deleting a file from her desktop. Chase and Vanessa didn't say a word. Neither did my father. They just let her declare me non-existent. And that was that. I packed my things that night. Just a couple of duffel bags, my acceptance letter, and my dad's old cast-iron skillet he never realized I took. He'd once taught me how to fry eggs in that pan when I was 8 before the business consumed him, and I became just another scheduled obligation on his calendar. I took the 6 a.m. flight out of Austin, watched the sunrise crack open over the city, and I didn't look back. Oregon was gray and quiet. The rain suited me. My apartment was barely more than a studio tucked over a used bookstore near the edge of Cedar Heights. The floor slanted and the heat barely worked, but it was mine. No trust fund, no monthly stipend. Just student loans, part-time jobs, and something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. I worked days at a cafe near campus and nights stocking shelves at a hardware store. On weekends, I shadowed community development meetings, volunteered with zoning task forces, and slowly, one spreadsheet at a time, I began to understand how cities breathe, how neighborhoods are built and broken, and how power isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's in the paperwork no one reads. I kept my last name because I earned it, but I told no one where I came from. In Portland, the name Maddox didn't carry weight. It didn't open doors or close them. I was just Sloan, a tired grad student who asked too many questions and showed up early to everything. My professors noticed. One of them connected me to a small local developer who wanted someone to help assess overlooked properties. That was my first real break. The job paid next to nothing, but I learned more in 6 months there than I had in 4 years of family dinners and fake networking luncheons. One day, while reviewing housing assessments in East Portland, I found a property listed as uninhabitable by the city. Maple Row Complex. A red brick L-shaped building from the 1950s with 24 units, most of them still occupied by elderly tenants. The landlord was trying to sell to a commercial developer planning to tear it down and build luxury townhomes. I asked for a tour pretending to be just another grad student doing fieldwork. What I saw stuck with me. Worn linoleum floors, walls patched with love mailboxes labeled in shaky handwriting. One woman had lived there since 1963. She offered me tea in a chipped mug and told me her grandson used to play in the alley before the drug traffic picked up. I walked out of there and called the property owner that night. He wanted $700,000. I had $30 in savings. I spent the next 6 months putting together a plan, applying for grants, pitching silent partners, and maxing out every favor I hadn't already burned. I formed Cedar and Sage Properties as a holding entity and signed the deeds 6 weeks before graduation. No one in my family knew. No one cared enough to ask. They thought I'd vanished. That I'd faded into some small life curled up in the rainy corner of the country. But I hadn't faded. I had just begun. And today, while they ate ribs and laughed about my so-called poverty, they were doing it in the backyard of a property I had quietly taken back. Not out of spite. Out of purpose. Maple Row was never supposed to be permanent. It was just a stopgap, a place I found in the classifieds with a monthly rent that didn't make my stomach twist. The brick exterior was faded, the halls smelled like old books and mildew, and the floor in my unit tilted so sharply I had to wedge a folded coaster under the back legs of my kitchen table. But it was quiet, mostly. Safe. And mine. My neighbors kept to themselves but watched everything. Mr. Keller, a retired army mechanic, lived 2 doors down and never wore shoes, not even in winter. Mrs. Lopez across the hall had a ceramic owl collection that lined her front window and glared at anyone who walked past too fast. There were single moms, a few cranky artists, a couple in their 70s who still slow danced in their living room every Friday night with the blinds open. It wasn't glossy, it wasn't Instagram-worthy, but it was human. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere that didn't require me to shrink or perform. The building had its problems. Plumbing that groaned in protest. A boiler that died every other month. Roof leaks that formed yellow bruises on the ceilings after every heavy rain. But the tenants didn't complain unless it was serious. Most of them had lived there long enough to know that affordable housing came with trade-offs, and that complaining too loudly often meant eviction when the next buyer came along. I started helping out before I ever owned the place. Fixing a screen door for Mrs. Lopez. Changing light bulbs for Mr. Keller. Replacing cabinet handles in the unit next to mine where a mom named Trina was trying to raise 2 kids while working night shifts at the hospital. They trusted me because I didn't act like I was better than them. Because I lived it too. When I found out the owner planned to sell, it hit me like a punch to the chest. I had overheard a phone call in the courtyard while hauling out my trash. He was talking to someone at a real estate firm in downtown Portland, mentioning phrases like redevelopment potential and tenant relocation assistance. I recognized the code. He was going to offload the building to a commercial developer, let them do the dirty work, and walk away with a check. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I pulled up every document I could find about Maple Row. parcel numbers, zoning records, tax liens. I called in a favor from an adjunct professor who specialized in historic preservation and asked him if the building qualified. Barely, he said, but maybe. It wasn't just about the building anymore. It was about the people. These were folks who didn't have the cushion of inheritance or connections. If they got displaced, there was nowhere affordable left to go. Portland had become another city priced out of its own residents, so I started pulling every lever I could reach. I used the blueprint I had built in grad school for a fictional redevelopment project as my base. I registered Cedar and Sage properties, scraping together the fees. I reached out to every small investor I knew pitched the idea like my life depended on it, which it did. I applied for city grants, historic tax credits, and low-income preservation subsidies. I consolidated my student debt into something barely manageable and dipped into the last of my savings. 3 months later, I made an offer. The seller laughed at first. He said no one serious offered that low, not in this market. But I knew he'd been struggling to offload for months, and I knew the commercial developers were dragging their feet over environmental assessments. I sweetened the deal by agreeing to close in cash within 30 days. I had no idea how I'd pull it off, but I did. The papers were signed 2 days before Christmas. I didn't throw a party, I didn't tell anyone. I just came home to the building that had sheltered me and sat on the steps out front with a cup of tea while snow began to fall, watching the windows light up one by one. Owning Maple Row didn't make me rich. In fact, it nearly broke me. But it gave me something the Maddox family had never offered: autonomy. Instead of flipping it, I renovated it carefully. I brought in a contractor I met through a preservation workshop who agreed to take on the work in stages. We focused on essentials first: roof reinforcement, plumbing upgrades, weatherproofing. I left the original hardwood floors, refinished them instead of ripping them up. The clawfoot tubs stayed. The cracked tile backsplashes got resealed but preserved. I installed garden boxes in the courtyard and started a tool-sharing shelf in the laundry room. Some of the tenants were skeptical. They thought the work meant eviction notices were coming next. I held a meeting in the courtyard, brought cookies, and explained everything. I'm not here to flip this place. I'm here to keep it livable. Mrs. Lopez hugged me after that meeting. Mr. Keller offered to help patch drywall. Trina left me a thank you card with a handprint from her toddler. Over time, the fear faded. Maple Row began to hum again, quietly but surely. The building was still old, still drafty in places, but it was cared for, and that made all the difference. I lived in Unit 3C the entire time. I still do. Every morning I walked past the same squeaky step on the second floor landing and reminded myself what I'd built. Not just a company, not just a portfolio, a community. Cedar and Sage wasn't just a name I picked off a tree guide. It stood for something. Strength, growth, roots. And it all started in a crooked little apartment above a used bookstore in a building no one else thought was worth saving. The second building I bought was 2 hours south of Portland, an old craftsman-style triplex tucked behind a shuttered diner and a broken chain-link fence. I found it listed on a community board at the library, written in faded ink on a curled piece of paper. Motivated seller, needs work. Cash preferred. It was a wreck. The siding was rotting, the roof sagged in the middle, and one of the kitchens looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s. But there was good bone beneath it all, and better than that, good people inside. A retired nurse named Margaret on the ground floor who still baked banana bread for her mailman. A single dad upstairs raising twin boys. I made an offer the same week. That's how it started. Quietly, carefully. One property at a time. I didn't scale quickly. That was never the point. I didn't want a development empire built on quick flips and empty units rented out to short-term tourists. I wanted something different. Something lasting. So I built slowly, like someone laying stone for a bridge she planned to walk across every day. Over the next 12 years, Cedar and Sage grew from a name on a grant application to a full-fledged investment firm, though I still hesitated to call it that out loud. We operated like a private trust, using a web of holding companies and single-purpose entities to acquire properties in underinvested neighborhoods. No press. No ribbon cuttings. Just steady, deliberate purchases of buildings no one else saw value in. By year 5, we had 17 properties. By year 10, that number was over 40. Apartment complexes, duplexes, former motels converted into transitional housing. A small strip mall where we helped local vendors open rent-controlled storefronts. A 5-acre lot in Eugene where we partnered with a food co-op and built community gardens around a shared-use kitchen. Every project had its own ecosystem, its own rules. But the values stayed the same. We preserved where others demolished. We reinvested where others extracted, and we kept tenants in place instead of using them as placeholders for higher-paying ones. Not everyone understood what I was doing. Some of my early investors pulled out when they realized I wasn't chasing the highest return. One even accused me of mismanaging the potential. "You're sitting on gold," he said once in a meeting. "Why aren't you mining it?" "Because I don't want to build a mine. I want to build a town." He didn't get it. Most didn't. But that was fine. I found new partners. Ones who believed in slow money and ethical development. Ones who cared about what the neighborhood looked like 10 years later, not just what it paid out in 12 months. We reinvested most of our profits back into the properties. Every year I took a modest salary enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. I stayed in Maple Row in Unit 3C. People thought it was eccentric. A CEO with a billion-dollar portfolio living above a bookstore with no elevator and a leaky shower head. But it grounded me. I never wanted to forget what it felt like to be on the other side of the lease. Around year 8, we began eyeing properties outside Oregon. Washington first. Then Northern California. A few trial runs in New Mexico and Arizona. But I always came back to one thought: what if I brought this model home? Austin had changed since I left. More condos, more cranes, more hollow glass towers filled with empty promises and high turnover. The neighborhoods I remembered as modest were now full of valet stands and wine bars. The name Maddox still echoed through city contracts and gala tables, but no one seemed to ask where the money came from. Prescott Yard was the jewel of it all. A historic Spanish-style estate, 3 acres of private gardens, fountains, and the kind of stonework no one made anymore. It had been passed down from great-grandfather Maddox to his son, then to my father, then placed in a complex family trust shared by Chase and Vanessa and their respective branches. My name had never been added. For years I let that fact settle like dust in the back of my mind. But as I watched the city I loved become a playground for speculators, I started to wonder what would happen if I reclaimed that ground. Not just symbolically. Literally. 9 months ago, a listing appeared in a private portfolio transfer. Prescott Yard was being quietly sold. It turned out that Chase, drowning in bad land deals in Nevada, had convinced the family board to liquidate and reinvest in tech infrastructure. He made it sound like a strategic pivot, but really he needed cash. They thought they were selling to a foreign trust, one of those faceless LLCs that swept up historic estates to use as film sets or corporate retreats. They didn't know the trust traced back to Cedar and Sage. They didn't know it traced back to me. I had spent a decade building the tools to stay invisible. I used a holding company based in Santa Fe. I hired a proxy negotiator. I moved the funds in layers, careful and legal. No attention. No questions. The deal closed in 45 days. When the documents arrived, I sat in my kitchen and stared at the signature line. My fingers shook as I signed, not from fear, from arrival. Prescott Yard was mine, and not because I inherited it. Because I earned it. I didn't tell anyone. Not Elaine, not my father. Not even Malcolm, my only true confidant, until the ink was dry. I wanted it to be real first. Since then I've watched the family continue to meet there. Same parties, same speeches, same old stories. They never wondered who signed off on the landscaper's invoices or approved the budget for the new fence. They never once thought it could be me. And now, with the 4th of July BBQ back in full swing, their folding chairs sinking into the grass of my lawn, I found myself standing at the grill watching them toast to their own brilliance and feeling not angry, not smug, but certain. They had no idea who really owned the ground beneath their feet. But soon they would. The day Malcolm called, I was elbow deep in building permits for a mixed-use property outside Tacoma. My phone buzzed twice, then again. I almost let it go to voicemail. But something in my gut told me to pick up. He didn't waste time. "I was digging through some of your grandfather's archives," he said, "and I found something you need to see." Malcolm Foster had been my father's closest friend once, long before Maddox Realty became a full-time machine, and they both forgot how to slow down. A former estate attorney, Malcolm had quietly retired to Bend after a health scare and a soured business deal, but we'd stayed in touch. He was one of the few people who knew who I really was behind Cedar and Sage. When I arrived at his home that weekend, he handed me a slim leather folder. Inside was an original copy of the Maddox Family Trust dated 1962, signed in neat cursive by Henry Thomas Maddox, my great-grandfather. His reputation had always been one of strict ethics and harder rules. A builder of neighborhoods, not just structures. The last page held a clause I'd never seen before. It had been omitted from every version the family used now. In the event that any beneficiary of this trust engages in conduct that compromises the integrity of these assets for personal gain or causes harm to community interests through neglect or malfeasance, said beneficiary shall forfeit all rights to control, profit from, or influence these holdings. In such a case, said rights revert to the trustee body or designated ethical administrator chosen by unanimous vote or legal arbitration. I read it twice. Then a third time. It was more than a warning. It was a safety hatch, a legacy clause designed to protect the original intent of the Maddox holdings. And someone had buried it. My jaw clenched as I remembered Chase's drunken brag about funding his Montana ranch with repair budget surpluses. Vanessa's art show invoices billed to the family foundation as donor cultivation. Elaine's silence while it all passed through unchecked. None of them would have survived this clause. Malcolm watched me carefully. "It's legally binding," he said. "But you'd need to make a case. Proof of violation. Clear misuse. Records. Internal memos. Expense reports." "I already have them," I said without thinking. I pulled out my laptop and opened a folder I'd been quietly building for months. Screenshots of Chase's expense approvals. Copies of Vanessa's event breakdowns. Property maintenance logs signed off with inflated vendor fees. Most of the paper trail had been easy to track once Cedar and Sage took ownership. The problem was never gathering evidence, it was deciding what to do with it. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his face lined with concern. "You could take this public, Sloan. If you wanted. You could challenge the board's authority, strip them of their voting shares. You'd win. But it would burn everything." "I know," I said. "So what do you want to do?" I stared at the clause again, my grandfather's signature and fountain penning still bold after all these years. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I want clarity. I want them to see what they've become, and I want to give them one last chance to fix it themselves." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Then you'll need to call a meeting." I already did. I had requested a family board session to follow the 4th of July BBQ under the pretense of discussing renovations and budget reallocations for Prescott Yard. No one questioned it. They assumed I was one of the anonymous advisors attached to the new ownership. They didn't bother to look deeper. I stood to leave, folder in hand. "Can I keep this?" "It's yours," Malcolm said. "Always should have been." Back in Portland, I worked through the night. I compiled the records into a presentation. Clean, legal, undeniable. I outlined every breach, every decision that violated either fiduciary duty or basic decency. I didn't embellish. I didn't add commentary. Just facts. I printed full packets for each board member. Bound, numbered, time-stamped. Then I added a cover page. Cedar and Sage Properties. Ethical Oversight Division. Prepared by Sloan Maddox. I stared at my name in black ink. The next day, Ella, my assistant, called from the office. "The estate's event staff confirmed the conference room will be cleared after the BBQ. 3 p.m. start. Everyone RSVP'd except your mother." "She'll be there," I said. "Elaine doesn't miss anything that could threaten her control." Isla hesitated. "Are you ready for this?" I let the question hang. "Ready isn't the word." I'm resolved. I spent the next few days tightening every detail. Legal notices in sealed envelopes. Digital backups on encrypted drives. Malcolm reviewed every word. We made no threats. We simply illuminated the truth and offered a choice. Prescott Yard's original deed hung on the wall of my office, yellowed and framed. Henry Maddox had signed that too. His notes in the margins referenced building codes, tenant needs, and utility access, not profit margins. He believed in architecture as responsibility. He built homes with wraparound porches and public libraries with benches shaded by sycamore trees. His descendants built loopholes. The day before the barbecue, I walked the edge of the Prescott Yard lawn alone, checking sprinklers and power lines, noting the layout of the chairs. It looked like a celebration. But beneath the paper, lanterns and stacked coolers, change was coming. Not loud, not cruel, just irreversible. The grill hissed as I pulled off the last batch of ribs, laying them on the platter with steady hands. My back was damp with sweat from the sun and the heat, but I didn't mind. The rhythm of cooking had always calmed me. It gave me something to do with my hands, something to focus on when the air got tight with judgment. Chase walked over with a plastic cup in hand, already buzzed and smug. He reached for the platter, his fingers grazing the edge of the rib rack I had just laid down. "Let me grab that Wagyu," he said, grinning. "Gotta make sure the real meat goes to someone who can appreciate it." He yanked the tongs from my hand before I could respond. The motion was careless, disrespectful, but casual enough to pass as a joke. Laughter rippled from a few chairs behind him. I wiped my hands on a towel, slowly resisting the instinct to flinch. Chase held the meat like a trophy, walking it back to the buffet table like he had won something. Behind me, Vanessa's voice carried. "So, Sloan," she called out with that syrupy tone she used when she wanted to draw blood. "You still living in that place? What was it called again? Maple something." A few heads turned. The circle around the picnic table grew quieter, listening. "Maple Row," I said calmly, still facing the grill. "That's right." Vanessa laughed lightly, swirling her wine in its glass. "Must be cheap. Rent control or something." The little boy next to her, maybe 7 or 8, leaned in toward his tablet and looked up at me. "My mom says rent control is for people who can't afford real houses." He said it like he was sharing trivia, not cruelty. Someone snorted. A few cousins covered their mouths to hide grins. Elaine didn't speak, but her lips curled at the corners. Her expression was polished, practiced. She looked me over with the kind of restraint that screamed louder than anything Vanessa or Chase could say. I set the spatula down on the edge of the grill and walked to the cooler, lifting the lid to grab a bottle of water. I twisted the cap slowly, taking a sip, letting the silence stretch. Then I turned around. "Maple Row," I repeated, raising my voice just enough for everyone to hear. "I don't rent there." Vanessa blinked. "I own it." A hush fell like a curtain. The breeze seemed to stop moving. Even the kids paused mid-bite. Chase squinted at me, trying to process. Vanessa opened her mouth, then closed it. Elaine's fan slowed in her hand. I wiped my fingers on a napkin and dropped it into the trash. Nobody moved. Then, like a shot breaking glass, one of the kids pointed at his tablet. "Wait," he said loudly, eyes wide. "Cedar and Sage. That's you." He turned the screen around. A cash news article glowed on the display, a headline that had run quietly in a niche development journal a few months back. Cedar and Sage CEO Sloan Maddox named top ethical developer in the Pacific Northwest. The table stared. The name sank in like ink on linen. "Cedar and Sage," Vanessa repeated, stunned. "That's your company?" I nodded once. "But that's a portfolio worth over $1 billion, Chase said, suddenly breathless. "That can't be you. You still live in a walk-up." "And yet, here we are," I said. Elaine stood slowly. Her pearls rested neatly against her collarbone. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left mine. The look wasn't confusion. It was recognition. "You've been buying up property?" she asked. Finally, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been restoring communities," I said. "Not just buying, preserving what matters. Maple Row, Coyote Hill, Belmont Commons. All of them." "But why?" Vanessa asked, her voice rising. Why pretend to be broke? I didn't pretend. I lived simply. You just assumed that meant I had nothing. Chase stepped forward, his face red, unsure if from sunburn or anger. You used our name. I used my own name. The one you told me not to consider mine anymore. For a moment, no one knew what to say. The air felt dense like a storm waiting to crack. Elaine finally broke the silence. This is what tomorrow's meeting is about, isn't it? I looked at her. Straightened my spine. Yes. Her expression didn't change, but her hands curled slightly around the edge of her chair. I see. I turned back to the grill, picking up the foil to cover the ribs. Chase still held the tongs forgotten in his hand. I'll bring these in, I said. Don't want them to dry out. Vanessa moved aside without a word as I passed. The air behind me felt electric, every eye on my back. Inside the house the air was cooler. I placed the ribs on the counter and took a long breath. They thought today would be like every other year. They were wrong, and tomorrow I would show them exactly how wrong. The sun had dipped below the skyline by the time I pulled into the gravel lot behind Maple Row. The air smelled like warm brick and cut grass. Porch lights flickered on one by one across the building like fireflies, each one glowing in its own quiet rhythm. Unit 1A's window was cracked open and faint jazz spilled out into the courtyard. A soft breeze rustled the plastic flags I'd hung between the garden boxes for the summer potluck we never quite got around to. As I stepped out of my car, I spotted Mrs. Lopez sitting on her stoop in a faded house dress, a blanket over her knees, and a chipped mug in hand. She looked up and waved me over. Evening, Sloan, she called out, her voice as steady as always. Tea's hot. You have a minute always. I crossed the courtyard, the soles of my sandals brushing over the edge of the flower beds we'd planted last spring. Daisies and lavender, all still alive despite my black thumb. Mrs. Lopez patted the cushion beside her. Sit. I'll pour you some. She reached for the thermos at her side and filled a second mug, steam rising into the cooling air. I took it with both hands and sat beside her on the step. How was your day? She asked, smiling like I hadn't just come from a war zone dressed up as a family BBQ. Eventful, I said. She chuckled like she already knew. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping our tea. The light from her porch bulb cast a soft glow over her owl wind chimes and the begonias lining her railing. In the distance, someone turned on a sprinkler. A baby cried. Somewhere upstairs, someone laughed. Life happening gently around us. You remember the summer of '91? She asked suddenly. I shook my head. I was too. She laughed again. Of course you were. Back then the whole block used to have night games for the kids. Freeze tag. Ghost in the graveyard. They'd run from Maple Row all the way down to the corner store. We didn't worry then. Doors were open. Neighbors looked out for each other. She looked out toward the street. Then things changed. Crime crept in. So did disrepair. Tenants started coming and going. But a few of us, we stayed. We loved this place even when it stopped loving us back. I rested the mug on my knee. You loved it enough to make it worth saving, I said. She glanced at me sideways. That's why you didn't tear it down, isn't it? I nodded. They offered me triple what I paid, I said quietly. One group wanted to put in a mall. Another wanted to build luxury lofts and call it Maple Flats like the past never happened. I said no, because of us. Because of you. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached out and placed a hand over mine. They don't deserve you, Sloan, but we're lucky you're here. I looked down at her hand. The same hand that had steadied generations of tenants through grief and joy, floods and leaky faucets. Do you remember when you fell in your kitchen last winter? I asked. She grinned. Banged my hip on that loose floorboard. I cursed in 3 languages. I had the entire floor replaced while you were at your daughter's, I said. Quietly. Told the crew not to say anything. She blinked, then let out a soft breath. I knew it didn't creak the same, she said. But I thought maybe I imagined it. You didn't. I just didn't want you to feel like a project. You always make us feel like people. That's the point. She sipped her tea and leaned back into the cushion. What happens tomorrow? The board meets. I tell the truth. They either fix it or get out of the way. And you, I stay right here. She smiled, satisfied with that. You know Henry Maddox built this building, she said. Your great-grandfather. I met him once when I first moved in. He brought me a pie. I didn't know that. He said homes were meant to shelter more than just bodies. They were meant to shelter dignity. I looked out over the courtyard. Garden beds. Bicycles stacked near the stairwell. A pinwheel spinning gently in the breeze. Then we have a lot to live up to, I said. Mrs. Lopez stood slowly, her joints cracking, and placed her empty mug on the railing. You already are, Sloane. They just don't see it yet. She kissed my cheek and shuffled back inside. I stayed there for a while, letting the night settle around me. Inside my apartment, a stack of audit reports waited, a binder full of legal documents. My navy suit hung pressed and ready by the closet. But for that moment, I didn't need any of it. For that moment, I was just a woman sitting on a porch in the place she fought to protect, listening to the echo of a neighborhood that still believed in itself. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The conference room at Prescott Yard had been cleared of decorations from the BBQ. No red cups, no folding chairs. Just polished oak leather-bound seats and an air that crackled with anticipation. The windows were cracked slightly to let in the Texas heat, and the filtered sunlight spilled across the table like a spotlight on every hidden truth waiting to surface. Malcolm stood at the head of the table, hands folded neatly over a leather folder. His voice was calm as he addressed the room. Let's come to order. Chase and Vanessa were seated together across from Elaine, who wore a silk blouse the color of ivory and her usual tight smile. At the far end sat Mr. Cunningham, a longtime board member who had always preferred listening to speaking. He nodded once in Malcolm's direction, then settled back with a pen in hand. Chase leaned forward, tossing a folder on the table. Is the investor joining us? He asked. I assumed someone from the Santa Fe Trust would be attending. Vanessa tapped her nails against a tumbler of ice water. I thought we were meeting to discuss the renovation budget. Not to be left in the dark by mystery landlords. Malcolm didn't answer. He glanced toward the door instead. I stepped inside, the heels of my shoes clicking softly against the floor. My navy suit was pressed simple and deliberate. My hair was pulled back into a low knot. No makeup beyond what I needed to look rested. The only accessory I wore was a thin silver watch my great-grandfather had given my father when he turned 30. Chase blinked. You're late, he said, then frowned. Wait, what are you? I set my briefcase on the table, unlatched it, and pulled out the audit packets one by one. 12 in total. Bound. Numbered. Color-coded. I laid them out in a careful line, watching as each person tracked my movements like they were witnessing something they couldn't quite explain. Elaine sat straighter. Vanessa's lips parted slightly. Mr. Cunningham didn't flinch. I looked up and met each of their eyes. My name is Sloane Maddox, I said. I am the founder and CEO of Cedar and Sage Properties. The entity you've referred to as the Santa Fe Trust is a holding company within my real estate portfolio. I placed a hand gently on the stack in front of me. I own Prescott Yard. And for the past 3 months, I've been overseeing a full forensic audit of all family-managed properties under your control. Vanessa's mouth opened then closed again. Chase laughed under his breath. This is a joke, right? No, I said. This is an opportunity. I slid the top file toward Malcolm. He passed it to Elaine. Inside you'll find documentation of fund misuse, inflated contractor invoices, and discrepancies between reported budgets and actual disbursements. All traced directly to accounts attached to this board. Chase leaned back hard in his chair, scoffing. You think you can waltz in here with your little folder and tell us how to run a legacy? Elaine said nothing, flipping through the pages slowly. I'm not telling you anything, I said. I'm showing you what you've already done. Vanessa's voice was tight. How did you even get access to these accounts? The same way I got access to the deed of this estate, I replied. I acquired them legally. And quietly. Because I wanted to see if integrity still had a place here. Chase snorted. You live in a shoebox. You show apartments to art teachers and retirees. What could you possibly know about managing real estate on this level? I've spent 12 years building Cedar and Sage, I said. We manage over $1.8 billion in residential and commercial property across 6 states. Our buildings maintain 94% tenant retention. Our developments are cited in national preservation journals. And none of it happened because I was handed anything. Elaine set her folder down gently. And what do you want from us now? Truth, I said. Transparency. A decision. Mr. Cunningham, quiet until now, finally spoke. I suspected it was you, he said, his voice low. When I saw the preservation language in the new maintenance contracts and the clause about limiting tenant displacement. Only one Maddox I ever knew cared enough to write that in. I nodded once. Thank you for waiting to see what I'd do. He gave a small nod in return. Elaine leaned back, her expression unreadable. So what happens if we say no? Then I forward everything to the ethics committee, the city's housing department, and the IRS, I said. Every receipt. Every altered record. I will strip the trust down to bare bones and rebuild it with people who remember what this was supposed to be. Chase stood, fists clenched. You'd do that to your own family. You already did, I said quietly. I'm just making sure someone cleans it up. Vanessa looked pale. You let us mock you. For years. I lived modestly because it aligned with my values, I said. You chose to see that as failure. That's on you. Elaine picked up the folder again, flipping to the page with the original trust clause Malcolm had uncovered. He really wrote this, she murmured. Your great-grandfather. Yes, I said. And it still stands. Unless you're prepared to say his word no longer matters. She looked at me for a long moment. Not as a mother. Not as a gatekeeper. But as a woman who'd just been caught in a mirror she didn't expect. Malcolm cleared his throat. The board has until end of day to vote on compliance. All members must either agree to the audit's recommendations and restore oversight or voluntarily relinquish their positions. The room stayed silent. I began collecting the extra packets, placing them back in my case. The next move was theirs. Chase was the first to break the silence. He shoved his chair back hard enough for the legs to scrape against the polished floor, then stood face flushed. This is a setup, he said. You've been planning this for years. I remained seated, hands folded on the table. I didn't need to match his volume. The truth was louder than either of us. I planned to preserve what our family built, I said. You're the one who planned to gut it. He laughed bitterly. You think waving some receipts around makes you right? I've carried half the weight of this legacy since I was 26. You were off playing renovation fairy in the woods. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a slim folder marked roofing contract, 2022. This is the invoice you approved for the Prescott Yard roof, I said. $2 million drawn from the Capital Reserve Fund. It needed replacing, he said flatly. Not at twice the regional market rate, I said, sliding the next sheet across the table. And not when that payment was routed through a third-party contractor registered to your holding company in Bozeman, Montana. The same month you closed on your ranch. He looked like he might lunge across the table. But instead he sat back down, jaw tight, saying nothing. Vanessa shifted in her seat as if trying to become smaller. Her hands were clasped tightly on her lap, her wedding ring glinting in the overhead light. And this, I continued, turning to the next folder, is a copy of the promotional budget for the Maddox Family Foundation's Spring Gala. You submitted these invoices under community outreach, but they list payments to your husband's gallery plus nearly $60,000 in unitemized art curation services. She blinked rapidly, mouth trembling. He was showcasing local artists, she whispered. It was exposure. At 3 times their commission rate, I asked. Because I also pulled the contracts from his gallery. Every one of them inflated and rubber-stamped by you. That's not exposure. That's theft dressed as charity. Elaine said nothing. Her folder remained closed. She stared at the edge of the table as if she could will herself elsewhere. I opened one last document and slid it to the center. This is the original trust clause from 1962. You won't find it in the current digital versions. It was buried during restructuring in the 80s. But it's valid. And binding. I looked directly at her. It says any beneficiary who exploits family assets for personal gain or violates community ethics forfeits their control and share. Vanessa's breath caught in her throat. You wouldn't do that. It's not my clause, I said. It's Henry Maddox's. I'm just following the rules he wrote. Chase leaned forward, sneering. And if we don't accept your power grab, if we challenge it, you're welcome to contest, I said. But I've already filed preliminary reports with the Oversight Committee, the Preservation Board, and the family's independent ethics advisor. You can drag this into court, or you can step down voluntarily and keep your name from further disgrace. He shook his head, laughing bitterly. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said softly. I think it makes me responsible. Elaine stood without a word. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She walked out of the room with quiet, deliberate steps, heels echoing against the tile. The door clicked shut behind her. Walter Maddox, my father, finally spoke. His voice was lower than I remembered, rough around the edges like old rope. I never understood why you left, he said, eyes on the folder in front of him. But now I do. I didn't speak. I just looked at him, not as a daughter begging for approval, but as a woman who no longer needed it. He picked up the folder and flipped through the pages slowly, as if seeing for the first time what he'd allowed to go unchecked. Vanessa was crying now, quietly. Not the loud performative sobs she used at fundraisers, but something smaller. Hollow. I didn't mean to hurt the foundation, she said. I believe you, I said, but you still did. Chase stood again, fists clenched. This is a coup. You'll regret this. I met his glare head on. This isn't revenge, I said. This is accountability. You made your choices. Now you face them. Mr. Cunningham stood slowly, closing his folder. I move to adopt Sloan Maddox's recommendations, he said. Full financial reform, board restructure, restoration of oversight per the original clause. Walter nodded silently. The vote passed without a single dissent. Chase stormed out. Vanessa followed, still crying. I remained seated. Malcolm glanced at me, a question in his eyes. But I didn't nod. I didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. And it wasn't over yet. 2 weeks can change the shape of a legacy. In just 14 days, the family I once stood outside of was forced to confront what it had become. Not with screaming or scandal, just paper signatures and the quiet force of truth. Prescott Yard transitioned almost overnight. The estate's operations were pulled from private family control and placed under a rotating board of licensed fiduciary managers appointed by Cedar and Sage. Maintenance contracts were rebid. Backdated invoices were canceled. And the decorative remodel Chase had commissioned to match his wife's Instagram aesthetic, scrapped. He didn't take it well. On the second day, he showed up at the estate unannounced, demanding to speak with someone from the new regime. The gate staff, now trained professional and under a formal lease agreement, turned him away. According to reports, he cursed at them, then drove off, nearly clipping the hydrangeas. By day 6, his financial consultant had resigned. By day 8, his ranch in Montana was quietly listed on the market with a motivated seller discount. When a local journalist asked him to comment on the board vote, he called the entire situation a witch hunt engineered by a bitter family member with a grudge. No one followed up. Vanessa disappeared from public life entirely. Her husband's gallery took down its website. Rumors circulated that they'd been served a formal notice of audit by the IRS after anonymous tips pointed toward tax-deductible art purchases labeled as educational outreach. Whether it came from me or someone else with access to the same records, I didn't ask. Isla did show me an article from a business ethics site. Headline: When Philanthropy Becomes Vanity, Lessons from the Maddox Foundation Scandal. I didn't click it. Elaine said nothing to anyone. She didn't return Malcolm's calls. She declined a press inquiry about her resignation from the Hillcrest Charitable Trust. A 2-sentence statement went out under her name, citing health reasons and the need for private reflection. I didn't believe it, but I also didn't need to anymore. Walter was the only one who reached out. He sent a letter. Not an email. A real letter in a cream envelope, his handwriting sharp but smaller than I remembered. It said simply, "You honored what I didn't. Thank you." There was no signature. Just his initials and a line that read, "Maybe you'll let me learn from you now." I folded it and placed it beside the original deed to Maple Row in a drawer I only opened for things that mattered. Cedar and Sage didn't slow down. We were never built to stop and celebrate. Within 2 weeks, we completed a transitional housing upgrade in Tacoma, submitted 2 zoning petitions for mixed-income developments near Spokane, and signed off on plans for a preservation partnership with the Oregon State Housing Council. I still reviewed every lease myself. Still met with property managers face-to-face. Still lived in Unit 3C where the kitchen tiles didn't quite match and the mailbox stuck on cold mornings. That's where the invitation found me. It came in a white envelope with gold embossing. The State Urban Planning Summit to be held in San Antonio. A keynote spot had opened. They wanted someone to speak about human-centered investment models that protect community heritage. I almost tossed it. But at the bottom, one sentence caught my eye. "We wish to highlight the Maple Row complex as a model for ethical preservation in an urbanizing America." I let the invitation sit on my desk for 3 days. Then I called Isla. "If I'm going to speak," I said, "I'm not dressing it up." She grinned. "I wouldn't let you if you tried." The venue was an old train depot turned civic space. The kind of place where old architecture met new ambition. I stood behind the podium in a dark green blouse and gray slacks, no slides, no flashy video. I talked about Mrs. Lopez, about cracked floorboards and garden boxes made from donated lumber. About replacing broken boilers before branding. About how roofs matter more than ribbon cuttings. When I finished, they stood. Not for me. For the idea. 3 city planners pulled me aside afterward. 2 banks offered new lending options to match our reinvestment timeline. A dean from the University of Texas asked if her students could intern with Cedar and Sage next semester. That night I returned to Portland with a packet of proposals and zero desire to be photographed. Isla told me my name had made its way into a national developers ethics watch list. Not the blacklist. The good one. Someone had called me the quiet architect of community dignity. I rolled my eyes, but I kept the article. Back at Maple Row, things were just as I left them. Mr. Keller had organized a neighborhood trash cleanup. The twins from 2B had left sidewalk chalk drawings of rockets and rainbows along the courtyard path. Someone planted rosemary near the benches. I walked the path alone, stopping to breathe in the scent of lavender mixed with warm cement. No red carpets, no fundraisers, no applause, just neighbors, just life. Just what we fought to keep. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel it. Not triumph, but peace. I was rinsing out a coffee mug when the knock came. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Like hesitation folded into rhythm. I dried my hands and crossed the room. Through the peephole, all I saw was denim. When I opened the door, my mother stood on the welcome mat in jeans and sneakers, holding a manila envelope clutched to her chest like a passport she wasn't sure would be accepted. Her blouse was plain, her hair pulled back with little effort. No pearls, no gloss. Just Elaine Maddox stripped of armor. "Hi," she said. I stepped back wordlessly to let her in. She didn't move right away, then crossed the threshold like it physically cost her something. I never noticed how small my living room was until she sat on the edge of the armchair, her posture stiff and hands still wrapped around the envelope. She glanced around, taking in the mismatched lamp, the hand-me-down bookshelf, the garden view through the balcony glass. "It's warm in here," she said. I adjusted the window slightly and sat down across from her. Silence settled between us like a careful guest. She looked down, then slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single photo. I recognized it immediately. Me at 22. Grinning under a graduation banner, my cap tilted, crooked hair in curls, holding a certificate with both hands like it might fly away. It wasn't from business school. It was from a local nonprofit where I'd volunteered as a housing assistant. A tiny line of ink across the bottom read, "Urban Planning Volunteer of the Year." "You sent this to your grandmother," she said quietly. "I found it after she passed. I never saw it before then." My mouth went dry. I hadn't even remembered mailing it. "I didn't think you'd want it," I said. "Maybe I wouldn't have then." She set the photo gently on the coffee table, smoothing it with one finger. You had that look on your face. Like you knew where you were going, even if we didn't. I didn't respond. Not yet. Elaine sat back a little, breathing deeper than she had since she arrived. I haven't come to apologize, she said. I know better than to think one apology fixes decades. I came because I never asked you why. Why you left. Why you turned down the shares. Why you moved into a building no one would have driven through without locking their doors. I looked at her. She was older than I remembered, not by years, but by posture. There was a crack in her voice, not from age, but from effort. I didn't leave to hurt you, I said. I left because I wanted to build something real. Not just inherit a title. Not just trade power back and forth in rooms full of people who never questioned why we had it. She nodded slowly. And now I'm doing what I set out to do. I'm not trying to prove anything anymore. She folded her hands in her lap. Would you be willing to teach me? The question hung in the air, heavier than I expected. You want to learn property law? I asked, half smiling. Well, maybe eventually. But I want to learn what I missed. The things I thought didn't matter. Why the families here trust you, why the contractors call you back, why you still live in a place with radiators that click when it rains. I stood and walked to the bookshelf, pulled out a folder from the middle shelf and handed it to her. Start with Mrs. Lopez, I said, and Mr. Keller. Then look at the tenant board meeting notes, and then come to the courtyard in 20 minutes. There's a bench and a pot of sun tea steeping under the rosemary. Elaine stood holding the folder like it might dissolve. Do you think they'll talk to me? They don't need you to be perfect, I said. Just honest. She nodded and stepped outside without another word. 20 minutes later, I found her in the courtyard sitting beside Mrs. Lopez, who was explaining the difference between the old wood beams and the new composite flooring cedar and sage had installed. Elaine was listening, notebook in hand, asking questions with genuine curiosity. She stayed for nearly an hour. At one point she laughed, really laughed, when Mr. Keller teased her for not knowing how to fix a screen door. Someone brought out lemonade. The sun dipped a little lower. I sat on the edge of the garden bed watching. This wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something softer. Recognition. Effort. A new kind of blueprint. Elaine looked across the courtyard at me. No words. Just a small nod. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for her approval. I felt like she was waiting for mine. The morning after felt quiet in a different way. Not empty, just complete. Sunlight filtered through the window over my kitchen sink, casting long streaks across the floor tiles. Outside, the courtyard was already alive. Kids zoomed past on bikes with streamers. Mr. Keller dragged his lawn chair out to his usual sunny patch. A group of tenants gathered by the mailboxes, chatting about weekend plans and who was bringing what to the next potluck. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, then paused as I heard a knock on the door. It opened before I reached it. Walter stood there holding a to-go tray with 2 cups and a sheepish grin. He wore khakis, a tucked-in flannel shirt, and sneakers that looked barely broken in. You weren't kidding about these stairs, he said, slightly winded. 3 flights and I already need a second coffee. I took the tray and handed him one of the cups. He followed me inside without asking. Let me guess, I said. You're here to ask for a job. Close. He sat at the counter and pulled out a thick notebook. Legal pad. Dog-eared. I'm taking a course online, contract law for small development firms. It's rough going, but I figured. Better late than never. I raised an eyebrow, impressed. There was a time, he continued, when your grandfather made us read every clause out loud before we signed anything. We forgot that. Got comfortable. Entitled. Then you reminded us. He sipped his coffee and looked around my small sunlit kitchen. This place isn't much, but it's honest, he said. Everything in it feels earned. I smiled. That's the idea. An hour later, he left with a stack of sample lease templates I printed for him. Said he wanted to understand what a fair lease looked like before talking about family assets again. I watched him cross the courtyard, slowly waving at Mrs. Lopez like she was an old friend even though they'd never spoken before last week. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a proposal from the National Heritage Housing Fund. A massive one. 7 figures. Full backing for Cedar and Sage to expand into 5 more states. Not just funding, but an offer to merge to go public. To take everything I had built and put it on a stage. I didn't open the attachment. Instead, I set the phone down and looked outside again. The real reward wasn't in expanding faster or being seen. It was knowing that this place these people didn't have to move every time someone richer came knocking. That night, I walked down to the basement storage unit, unlocked the door, and pulled out an old shoebox. Inside were the blueprints to the original Maple Row structure. Hand-drawn. Smudged in places from age. On the back, scribbled in pencil, was a single note in my great-grandfather's handwriting. Build for hearts. Not just for returns. The next day, Cedar and Sage celebrated its 12th anniversary quietly. No gala. No press release. Just a staff lunch in our office break room, where someone brought homemade pie and Ela made a slideshow of buildings we had restored over the years. I looked around the table and realized every single person there had started with nothing fancy. No inherited titles, no legacy shares, just grit. And a belief that integrity wasn't negotiable. When I stepped outside that evening, the sky over Portland was painted in gold and pale lavender. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime danced. Maple Row wasn't just preserved, it was alive, and so was I. For years I had carried the weight of being the disappointment, the outlier, the one who didn't fit their version of success. But I didn't build Cedar and Sage to prove them wrong. I built it to protect the kind of spaces I never saw growing up. The places where people weren't just tolerated, they were valued. Where community wasn't just a word on a plaque, but something you heard in laughter across balconies and smelled in the smoke of a Sunday barbecue. If you've ever been underestimated, counted out, or made to feel like the seat at the table was never meant for you, then maybe you'll understand this part best. This was never about revenge. It was about rebuilding. And this time, I'm the one holding the keys. If you've seen yourself in my story, I'd love to hear yours. What have you built in silence while others weren't watching? Drop your thoughts below. Let's give each other credit for the quiet work, the long nights, and the roads taken without permission. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this about redemption, about resilience, and about redefining success on your own terms. Because legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you create.